Oleksandr Syrsky, he's been running the land forces since 2019. He's an experienced hand. He knows what he's doing, and he'll probably bring some fresh ideas. And it looks like what President Zelensky wants for the start of the sort of spring as the next fighting season starts.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are catching up with Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, a former fighter pilot whose 32-year career in the RAF included commanding one fighter squadron and the Harrier Force, tours of Bosnia, Sarajevo, the Gulf and Afghanistan, and heading a strategic combat air review. He's now a prominent military analyst and host of the podcast Red Matrix. Sean Bell, welcome back.
Hi, Kate. Good afternoon to you.
Sean, we are speaking shortly after it was announced that President Zelensky has replaced his top general in Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, with Oleksandr Syrsky. It's not so much of a surprise that he has been removed, is it?
Not really. I think Volodymyr Zelensky's been looking over the war effort since the start in February 22. And if you look back through history, military commanders often need to be refreshed along the way. It's also, if you look at the way that the war has gone for Ukraine, it's not been easy. You know, the much vaunted spring offensive didn't come off. And inevitably, the friction between the political masters and the military commanders often gets very exacerbated at times, the difficulty. Political masters want to see progress, want to drive their military forward, whereas the military leaders often tire of watching sending many of their soldiers to their death. They worry about the toll on the remaining forces and the resilience of the country. So it's quite normal to put fresh people in. And as you say, Oleksandr Syrsky, he's been running the land forces since 2019. He's an experienced hand. He knows what he's doing, and he'll probably bring some fresh ideas. And it looks like what President Zelensky wants for the start of the sort of spring as the next fighting season starts.
And it comes at a time where we're approaching the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion. It is a moment, really, that's quite critical, is it not, with what's at play in terms of funding for Ukraine in question, elections on the horizon, and at the moment on the ground, you know, the ground war itself seems largely unmoving in terms of the front lines.
Yeah, there's a lot there, isn't there, Kate? I think from a grand strategic perspective, you know, the much anticipated spring offensive last year failed to really deliver. Wintertime is always very difficult to continue fighting. On the three fronts, at least in the Donbass, the Russians have been continuing to be on the front foot through the winter, focused on the Donbass. But it's very difficult to see what happens next. At the moment, the Russians are sort of pausing a little bit, waiting for President Putin to have his elections early in March. Once that's over, it's very possible that Russia will double down. And the question for President Zelensky, and particularly for Ukraine, is what next? You know, they had a lot of support from the West, lots of weapons, lots of money, lots of military training. That didn't turn the dial. So what will it take to turn the dial? And is that support available? Lots of really big questions waiting for this year.
Do you see any potential options there?
Unfortunately, as a military guy, I'm a bit more of a pragmatist. We in the West unlocked the war cabinet. In effect, back in September of 22, President Zelensky's forces pushed back Russian forces up in the north of Kharkiv. 12,000 square kilometers were liberated in a matter of weeks. And in effect, Zelensky turned around to the West and said, look, give me the tools. I can do this. So the West did. They provided tanks, they provided anti-tank missiles, they provided lots of missiles, armaments, ammunition, and etc., and military training. The spring offensive started in June, and it didn't really move the front line at all. Now, even if the West was to give the money, and at the moment the EU's finally unlocked the money, the US hasn't, and it's by no means a foregone conclusion that money will be unlocked. Even if it could provide the money, the weapons stores have been emptied. They are just not available. And the West hasn't yet spun up its defense industrial base to provide them. So it's very difficult even to match what was provided last year. And that wasn't enough for Zelensky to prevail. So I think from a pragmatic perspective, clearly it's up to Zelensky to decide what he wants to do next, continue the war, and where he sees prospects for success. But as a military analyst, it's quite difficult to see how they're going to prevail in this coming year. And even independent assessment is that both sides are going to struggle to make any strategically important moves on the battlefield anytime soon.
And Sean, the last time we spoke, it was about the F-16 fighter jets that Ukraine so desperately needs. Can you update us on what is happening with those deliveries and how soon they might actually carry out their first airstrike in this war?
Well, firstly, I think it's worth pointing out that although everybody sees the F-16s as the Great White Hope, most of the senior commentators and certainly in my contacts in the MOD have been pretty clear that this is not about having an influence on the war today or tomorrow, but when the war is over and Ukraine will need to have its own national defense capability, then if you start from scratch, it will take several years to train the pilots, get the aircraft in, the engineers, the spares, everything in place. So by leaning into that and starting the pilot training now, which is the longest pole in that particular tent, then it would mean that earlier rather than later, Ukraine would have its own seed corn of a combat air capability based on Western aircraft. I don't think there was ever an intention that they be involved in the fighting anytime soon. And in terms of the actual aircraft, the first batch of aircraft, I understand, which was due to come from Denmark and Holland, some of those aircraft were only going to be donated once the replacement aircraft, the F-35, were in place. There's been some delays to that. I understand there's a 6-month delay on getting the F-16s into Ukrainians' hands. But bluntly, Kate, I flew jets most of my life. And even if you were to park 50 F-16s on the lawn outside Kyiv, that would not change the dial. It would simply give the Russian Air Force a great bit of target practice. And I'm being flippant, but it wouldn't change the dial. There is so much more to air power capability than simply the aircraft. And there's a lot more training, a lot more understanding of Western weapons, defensive aid suites, and the like, before they would ever become combat effective.
So, in that light, that the 6-month delay that we think those first Danish planes for their arrival is not necessarily a big issue.
No, because ultimately it's not just about the aircraft. It's also about the weapons, about the air defense missiles. It's about the secure communications. It's about the radar. It's about Link 16. It's about so many other elements that have to come together. So yes, aircraft delivery is one vital part, but actually until you get the thing that takes the longest is pilot training, and you won't have sufficient pilots that are credible and capable. And let me give you an example, because it's quite a difficult one to explain clearly. The pilot training takes several years, but even when you're combat ready on a frontline squadron, it's effectively by like a 17-year-old who's just passed his driving test. Yes, he can drive, but he's virtually uninsurable because he's a danger to shipping. And in a way, the first guys, when they are combat ready on the squadron, they are the starting rung of the ladder, which takes about 3 years before they're genuinely useful across the full spectrum of warfighting capability. So whilst the aircraft, the pilots that they're being transferred and retrained from Ukraine will be very competent at flying the F-16, it'll be some years before they're really competent at being a combat capability on that platform.
Okay, so let's talk about drones then. President Zelensky, he has announced a decree to create a separate drone system force within the Ukrainian armed forces. He states that drone systems have shown their effectiveness on land, in the skies and on the seas. Can you just assess for us the impact that drones have made for Ukraine's defensive and offensive actions, and how much of an impact this will have in developing those capabilities?
I think the advent of drone warfare has advanced dramatically in the Ukraine-Russia war, and I think will have profound implications for our own national defence. For years over the battlefield, they use balloons to put people up to observe over the battlefield. That's been around for 100 years, and drones doing it, is the sort of modern incarnation of that. But now that technology has made sensors, lasers, and everything so light, and the battery technology to make these drones so endurable, what's been happening is the Russians have put GPS jammers up. So overnight, the Ukrainians have been adapting the drones to load up terrain mapping radar, other ways to navigate. And it's been a really fast evolution of capability that's been changing overnight. That's not something that we do anytime very quickly in the West at all. And therefore, it's going to be a huge revolution. The other use of drones has been on slightly larger drones, where Ukraine is not allowed to use Western weapons to attack Russian soil. But the Ukraine has been able to use its own drones, long-range drones, to attack Moscow. It is worth pointing out, though, they are more a tactical nuisance than they are strategically effective, because they're not really taking out any major targets, but they are an embarrassment to Russia. And if you look at maritime drones, what the Ukrainians have been very effective at doing, even though they don't have an established navy, and Russian navy should dominate the Black Sea, Ukraine's been very effective at using drones and missiles to take out over 20% of the Ukrainian Navy and forcing it to operate right on the east side of the Black Sea, and therefore stopping it being effective. So it's been really interesting to see the use of drones, how they've evolved and how rapidly. And of course, that's why Zelensky wants his defense industrial base to deliver 1 million drones to the Ukrainian armed forces next year. And the reason he wants to build them is he also wants to be able to adapt them quickly as the need arises against the Russians.
And in making that announcement, President Zelensky said this is not a question for the future, rather it must provide concrete results in the very near future. This year must be decisive in a great many aspects. And you get the sense that while waiting for that desperately needed ammunition, the air cover, the continued US aid, he's very aware of the pressure not to give any window of opportunity for Russia to gain momentum.
You're absolutely right. And I think part of this is there's a part of this war that's about defense, and there's a part of it about offense. Clearly, if you're on defense, your enemy has the initiative and you want to try to avoid that. And therefore, you want to make sure you're on the offense. The trouble is you need some pretty significant military capability to do that. And as we've discussed, there is a three-front war going on at the moment. Over to the west, the Dnipro River, the Russian forces are pretty light there because the Kharkovka Dam was blown. That protected their western flank, but by all accounts, Ukrainians have made their way across the river and are holding out at the moment. The second flank is up to the east of Zaporizhzhia. That's where those three layers of defense the Russian built, the Dragon's Teeth, the ditches and the minefields, that although Ukraine has made progress against those, they haven't actually got through. And the third area is the Donbass, and that seems to be where the Russians are on the front foot, largely because it appears Putin's only ever described this as a special military operation, and most experts believe that's because he wants to secure the Donbass, make sure he doesn't lose Crimea and the land bridge in between, and if he can secure that, he might well be prepared to call it a day. But until he secures the Donbass, he's not going to stop. So at the moment, the Russians appear on the front foot, and that's something that will be a worry to Zelensky.
And President Zelensky has backed a bill also to boost army numbers, which he had previously rejected. The revised mobilisation bill has passed its first reading, and it would lower the age of military service and make it harder to avoid the draft. A real sign that after 2 years, the strain is starting to show, but it will be felt on both sides, won't it?
It will. I mean, there's two sides to this, one of which obviously is manpower and one of which is ammunition. And I think the manpower side, one thing that President Zelensky has been very careful to avoid is getting dragged into a war of attrition with Russia, because in a war of attrition, both armies line up on the battlefield, have a go at each other. The biggest army generally wins. Well, the Russians have the access to far more resources than Ukraine does. So if you get locked into that war of attrition, it's inevitable what the result will look like. But the Ukraine's been very good at conserving manpower, but inevitably, who would have expected the war to be going on for 2 years? And it's widely reported the Russians have lost around 300,000 soldiers, potentially 100,000 killed, 200,000 badly injured. We don't have comparable figures for the Ukrainians, but that's a big loss for any army to take. And therefore, it was inevitable that Ukraine was going to have to increase the volume of its personnel inducted into the army. The big challenge, of course, though, is ammunition and weapons. Now, of course, Russia has access to North Korea. North Korea has been providing 1 million artillery shells and missiles. It's been looking to Iran, that's provided some ballistic missiles, cruise missiles and the like. And, of course, Russia has a huge defense industrial base that can be funded by oil revenue, and it's spinning that up rapidly as well. And Ukraine can't really attack it because it can't use Western weapons. In contrast, the Ukrainians, every time they build a factory, it takes months to do that. Russia fires a missile and flattens it. So unless the West can provide those missiles, again, there's an inevitable outcome because Russia will be able to restock its inventory quicker than the West can support Ukraine. And that's why this flow of aid is so vital, particularly the West promised 1 million rounds of artillery ammunition to Zelensky by the end of March. It looks likely only half of that will be delivered. And that's, I'm afraid, indicative of the level of support from the West.
You mentioned supplies from North Korea to the Russians, and yesterday there was more proof of that because debris was found of a DPRK marked missile after a strike on Kharkiv. What more can the West do, or can it do anything to speed up the manufacturing of the munitions that Ukraine so badly needs?
One of the challenges has been that we've largely given old war stock to Ukraine. A good example of that are there's a whole range of missiles that have been provided that were at the end of their life. We either were going to have to pay to have them decommissioned, or we gave them to Ukraine, and we weren't too worried if that technology fell into enemy hands because it was going to be upgraded anyway. Now that we've exhausted the supplies of some of those missiles and weapons, it's not easy to get them replaced because you can't do like for like. Most of those old weapons are obsolete. You can't, sort of 30-year-old missiles. If you imagine what your mobile phone was like 30 years ago, it would be very difficult to replace that because none of the bits and bobs inside it, none of the chips are made anymore. So first of all, there's a real challenge of doing that. But actually, there's also the challenge, unfortunately, is of intent. And it's a harsh thing to talk about. But when the war started, although Ukraine wasn't in NATO, the West was worried. It's seen 2 world wars start with an invasion of a European country, and therefore was genuinely worried about Russia suddenly stepping through Ukraine and then start to rampage through Europe. So it was naturally disposed to help Ukraine. Where we find ourselves today is that Ukraine still wants to liberate its lands, but is Russia the same threat to Europe as it was 2 years ago? And the answer is firmly no. Russia has been decimated by this war in Ukraine. It's lost well over 2,200 main battle tanks, some of its most modern. It will take a decade before it's ready to do any sort of overt military action against another country. And therefore, the appetite of the West for continuing to support Ukraine is inevitably coming under question, which is why in America, a majority of the people polled out there do not favour supporting a continuing support to Ukraine. And that makes life very, very difficult for President Zelensky.
But when you say that kind of flies in the face of what a lot of people and countries, for example, Poland and Estonia, have been saying recently about the potential of Russia coming into conflict with NATO in the coming years. Are they all wrong?
I think it depends where you're living. So if you are in America, thousands of miles away from the front line, you probably don't feel the urgency of this at all. And you look just at the metrics. If you are Polish and this is all happening on your doorstep, and you have a history of a couple of world wars of being badly treated throughout that time, you are going to be much more concerned about the prospects of war on your doorstep, which is why Poland has escalated its defence spending to 4%. But I do think the wider point here is that for some years, NATO has been the bedrock of our European security. But it's been interesting that not all of the countries that enjoy that protection have been paying the recommended 2% of GDP. About 7 countries do, the vast majority do not. And I think what's happened as a result of this invasion, in a way, America's turned around and said, now come on, NATO, yes, we'll provide protection, but everybody needs to be paying their premiums. Otherwise, you're relying on America that pays 4% of its GDP. We pay 2%, and there are a lot of countries that don't. And that's, I think, why a lot of countries like Poland feel the threat, feel the heat of the Russian presence much more keenly than America, which is why they're increasing their spending.
And only this week, Poland has felt the heat because as part of this huge combined series of missile and drone attacks across Ukraine, some were fired towards Lviv, which is close to the Polish border. And in response, Poland scrambled at least 3 F-16 fighter jets to secure its airspace. Is this the kind of response that Russia was hoping for from Poland, perhaps?
I'm not so sure. It's pretty clear that Russia expected to have encounter far less resistance when it went into Ukraine than it has encountered. And the last thing that Russia wants to do at the moment is pick a fight with NATO. It's particularly ill-equipped to do that. So whilst it wants to demonstrate that it still has capability, that it still wants to complete its military task in Ukraine, I very much doubt if President Putin wants to pick a fight with NATO, and therefore he's going to operate near the borders of NATO. That's inevitable with a country like Ukraine, but I'd be very surprised if he actually wants to pick a fight.
So that thought that perhaps it's some kind of probing to test the Polish response times and how they would react is a void argument. It's nothing to do with that.
It's easy to put stories around this, but the very fact is that if Putin wants to pick a fight with NATO, that is not a fight he can win, and that would quickly escalate. And he does not have the military capability. And what people like autocrats like Putin have to cling on to power, and they use their military as part of that tool. He can't afford to see his military decimated even more, because that would place him in a much more vulnerable position. It's far more likely that he will seek to complete his military objectives in Ukraine, pause, and then see whether to seek a negotiated solution with Zelensky so that he can reset his relationship with the Western world, or whether he rebuilds his military and then presses on with his ambitions in Ukraine over the coming years.
In Britain, Defence Intelligence, which opened its doors to defence journalists this week at RAF Witten, that's the military intelligence hub, as you'll know, sharing information with Five Eyes countries, US, Canada, New Zealand and Australia. It had 2 drones in a hangar, an Orlan 10 and an Iranian Shahed 131. It was gifted by the Ukrainians to them after they were shot down. The reporter who there was, she described it to me as sort of being shown to them in like evidence bags. Can you just tell us a bit about those drones and what kind of intelligence or evidence they would be looking for exactly to help?
One of the things about technology, ever since the advent of warfare, and particularly my time in Germany, you're always trying to get hold of the enemy's equipment, because then you can work out how to circumvent it. And there's always been, whether it's how does their radar work, because then if you know how their radar works, you can work out how to counter their radar. So seizing potential adversaries' equipment is really helpful to work out how to combat it. So now these Shahed drones are not exactly high tech, but when you get hold of them, you can work out how much fuel they hold, therefore you know how much range they've got. You can also work out how their guidance system works, and therefore where they're going to be vulnerable. Is it lasers? Is it electronic warfare? Are jammers going to be effective? You can also work out where the vulnerable points on them are, and therefore work out how you would aim to shoot them down, and also the control mechanisms that are used. So there's lots of ways that this intelligence can be used very rapidly for the mad scientists that do all of the work behind the scenes can develop some really sexy capability to work out how to destroy these drones, because they take a lot longer to develop than they take to work out where their vulnerabilities are.
And just to return to where we started, Sean, the shake-up of Ukraine's military leadership, do you think this signifies a change in direction for Ukraine's military campaign? Is this a turning point, do you think?
I'm not sure. It's one thing what your ambitions are. It's quite another what your resources will let you do. The conundrum for Ukraine is that if you're on the offensive, which is clearly what Ukraine needs to do if it's to liberate its territory, you generally lose 3 times as many people as you do on defense. And the danger of a sustained offense by Ukraine, if they lose a lot of people, the danger that makes them very vulnerable to a Russian counterattack. And if Russia was to break through, it could sweep and take a lot more of Ukraine than it currently has. And that's something that you have to judge. And that balance, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Volodymyr Zelensky, the outgoing head of the army, saw that one way, and that President Zelensky sees that a very different way. And that will be for the new commander to make his own judgment and decide where the balance lies between risk and reward. And that's the challenge they're going to face as they embark on this coming year.
Sean Bell, thanks for your time.
You're very welcome.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.